But right now, I would love to introduce Valerie. Valerie, is she around? She is. G'day, Valerie. Welcome, Valerie. Valerie's actually going to talk to us about where can I actually put a tiny house. Valerie is actually from ESC Consulting, which is based in Brisbane. And ESC Consulting do work particularly around how to help and find out the places and policies and plans and all the stuff that goes around this type of housing and this type of, idea. Is that right, Valerie?
Yep.
All right, now tell me, just before you start, what do you love most about the idea of changing up the paradigm of housing and the way we live? What do you love most about it? So go up.
It's about providing a solution to a lot of problems that are out there. We're not saying that tiny houses are going to be the solution, but I think it definitely needs to be in the mix.
Yeah.
And it's about helping people.
Awesome. So would you welcome Valerie as she talks to us about where can I put a tiny house?
Thank you. Good morning. Yes, so we've been invited to answer this question for you today, although I would like to slightly modify it to be where can I legally put my tiny house? Because strictly speaking, if you really wanted to, you can put it anywhere. So who are we who is ESC Consulting in being able to answer this question for you? We put together a document nearly 2 years ago now called the Tiny House Planning Resource, which came about after helping Lara Noble, who's talking later this afternoon, and her partner win an appeal against Brisbane City Council to allow them to stay in their tiny house on wheels in a friend's backyard in Brisbane City. And after doing this work, my business partner, Rikki, and myself came to realise two things. One is that there's really a place for tiny houses to be a mainstream housing option. And the second thing was that the key barrier to have tiny houses be a mainstream option is all around the planning and the building regulations. So we set out to write this document with the help of a bunch of great people, including town planners, builders and researchers. And it was really aimed at being a bit of a conversation starter with councils and state planning departments to explore what are the opportunities for tiny houses. So that's really was the goal of that document. We made that document free. It's available electronically from our website and a few other places. And we did that on purpose so that people like yourselves could actually grab that document and take it into your council to start that discussion as well and create a bit of a movement there. So the presentation I'm going to give you today is about the regulatory framework and how it impacts tiny houses. So it's going to be a bit of a dry topic, and I've tried to avoid the jargon, but there will be some references in there. And this is going to be a bit of a crash course into how that framework impacts what you are trying to do by wanting to live in a tiny house. There are three key aspects to the framework, to the regulations that impact tiny houses. The first one is about land use, and that's your planning framework. So your council planning schemes, for example. And it's all about what you can do where in a local government area. There's the building regulations, obviously about how you build things. And what I've called the health and nuisance regulations, which are kind of about how to live, nicely next to your neighbour. And I'm just going to go quickly a little bit deeper to explain what each of these are about. So the land use, as I said, is all about the planning. So at the top is the Planning Act, Planning Act 2016 for Queensland, which essentially describes the process under which planning works in the state. But it does contain a number of definitions which are quite important and which drive what happens down at the council level. The planning schemes are subordinate to the Planning Act. They have to answer to what's in the legislation. But they are tailored to the local area, to the local government area. And the picture at the back on this slide, for example, is the zoning map from the Noosa plan. And as you can see, there's lots of coloured blocks, which are the zones which dictate what you can do on that bit of land. So those zones cover, commercial use, industrial, educational, environmental conservation, obviously residential, etc. And within the planning scheme, there will then be codes which say, this is what you're allowed to do in that zone, and these are the criteria you need to meet to be able to do that thing. And I'll have an example down the back end of a presentation about how those things are structured, how the codes are structured. But essentially, if you can put in a proposal that ticks all the boxes for those codes, you should be able to get an approval fairly straight away on your development application. If you can't, then you may still be able to do what you want to do, but you will need to have to really go deep into justifying why you should be able to do it. On the building regulations side of things, it's pretty straightforward. It's covered by the National Construction Code. Obviously, it's a national document. Each state does have its own sort of variations in there. But those regulations enforce three key things. Safety, so think, electrical wiring, structural framing. Health, and this is about things like, having ventilation in your bathrooms to prevent mould. It's about things like having high-performance glazing if you happen to live next to a busy road. And energy efficiency, and probably water efficiency as well in there at the moment for Queensland. And then the health and nuisance regulations. As I said, it's about living nicely with your neighbours. So these are implemented through local laws, and each council will have a set of its own local laws. It's up to them to define what they are. They cover pretty much the same set of topics though, so you'll find local laws around street parking, around noise, but this time it'll be about, how late can you have a party with loud music before your neighbours can start to formally complain about it. And obviously what's really relevant for us, it's about living in a caravan, and a lot of councils have rules around that. So the challenge really is, how do we go about amending these regulations to allow tiny houses as a mainstream option? Before I continue into the presentation, I'm going to take you through different scenarios to show you how the regulations impact tiny house living, and then we'll go into how can we amend those things. But there's two things in the work we've done in the tiny house planning resource. We've identified two types of tiny houses, and the land use, so the planning framework and the building regulations are all about permanent fixed structures. And in our tiny house planning resource, we've identified fixed tiny houses, so tiny houses on foundations. So essentially your normal mainstream dwelling, but just tiny. Contrasting that with what we've called movable dwellings, which are impacted by those local laws. So we're talking tiny houses on wheels, tiny houses on skids, possibly even the containers, anything that's not tied down to the ground. I will have a scenario though where I will show how the planning regulations actually do impact tiny houses on wheels as well. So they're the two types of tiny houses that I'm going to talk about, so I'm going to take you through some scenarios. A big disclaimer before I go ahead, a lot of the information that I'm providing today was based primarily from Brisbane City Council's, the planning scheme from that, and I've generalised it. I've done that because Brisbane City Council is where we do most of our work, and that's the one I'm most familiar with. I have been able to find a little bit of time to look into the Noosa plan, and I've added some information about that. So just bear in mind that the information is generalised, and unfortunately the answer for most cases when people are asking, can I do this? The answer is, it depends. So the most legal and what we call supported way, and by supported I mean the planning framework allows it. It's already, considered and taken care of and defined, and there's codes for it, and that's the granny flat. And the planning schemes will have different names for it, whether it's ancillary dwelling, secondary dwelling, whatever. But essentially it's about having a smaller dwelling occupying the same land as the main house. Usually there's restrictions about how big that secondary dwelling can be, how far away from the main house it needs to be, etc. But all those things really play to the advantage of tiny houses. The big drawback are the standard restrictions about who can live in a granny flat. So most councils will restrict it to family members, family relations, which means that you can't normally rent out your granny flat. That's not legal, strictly speaking. New South Wales, I think it's nearly 2 years ago now, introduced a change where they relaxed those restrictions. So they allowed people to put in granny flats and could have them rented out to anyone. That saw a huge surge in granny flat construction across the state. It probably didn't have a great impact on helping people with affordability or people, who are looking for somewhere to put their own tiny house, because a lot of them ended up being rented out as Airbnb type places. Another model, another legal way that we have come across, and that's being proposed down in Melbourne. There's a group that are trying to get this up and running. It's called the caretaker model, and again, you'll find it in most planning schemes. It's about having a dwelling set up on land which has a non-residential use. So think about, somebody being hired to look after a factory site once all the workers have gone home, for example. Obviously, non-residential means an industrial site, a factory, I don't know, I'm not so sure about commercial, but some of the nicer places could be like a nursery or a community garden or a market garden, where you could have that role as a caretaker. So that's the other restriction, is that you must be employed by the business to be able to live on those premises as the caretaker. In our tiny house planning resource, we also explored the option of subdividing land into tiny lots so that people didn't have to go, especially when you're talking about a fixed tiny house, didn't have to go and buy a conventional size block of land, which can be quite expensive, when you're going to be putting a tiny house on it. So we looked at the concept of tiny lots, and most planning schemes actually mandate a minimum lot size right now, which is still in around the 300, 400 square metre mark. But we do know of places where 80 square metre lots, for example, are being trialled over in WA. And there are other places, other estates which are being developed in conjunction usually with state government, where they're trying for innovative sort of developments, where they have gone down to quite small sizes. And so that's certainly being trialled, and hopefully that's the kind of thing that might come through. The problem with doing these sorts of things as a land developer, for example, so if you were a tiny house land developer wanting to create tiny lots, the cost of actually, you bought a block of land and you wanted to subdivide it into tiny lots, that's actually quite a costly exercise at the moment. And whether you would be able to recoup the cost of that subdivision from the sale of those lots is something that would need to be investigated. So this is an extract from the Noosa plan. And as you can see on the top line, for detached housing in certain parts of Noosa, you're still looking at minimum sizes of 2,000 square metres, but the smallest is 600. So you're still looking at fairly large blocks of land. Brisbane City has the concept of a small lot in specific zones that will allow it. So you can get down to the bottom one is 180 square metres, but those kind of sizes are really targeted at townhouse developments. So they're aimed at particular products and do not really fit the tiny house model. So if you're a tiny house developer, you would be easily able to meet the code, for example, because that's what's considered in the code, and you'd be able to do this. But if you wanted to do something with tiny houses, that's where you would need to do a lot of extra justification. Which brings me to the tiny village concept, and that's been talked about. I know yesterday was the Eco Villages Day, and Sandy talked about the cluster of tiny houses. And this is, for us, another disclaimer, I guess, is the work we've done in the tiny house planning resource has really been focused on the urban areas. We haven't really looked at rural settings because we think that there's actually a demand for this and a need for these sorts of tiny house developments in our cities. So the kind of village we kind of envisaging are not, the 30 to 100 people, but clusters of 6 to 8 tiny houses. So again, they're legal, as in most planning schemes will have what they call a multiple dwelling or a multiple housing kind of definition. But what we're saying is for tiny houses, then this is not supported. So again, multiple dwelling covers things like apartments, townhouses, units. So it becomes a bit more difficult to do something like this. The big restriction, as Sandy said, is about finding the land where you can do this kind of thing. A lot of it is to do with zoning. So Brisbane City Council, for example, will allow multiple dwelling developments close to public transport hubs, close to the city, but you'll find it difficult to do in a low density residential area. Another, it's not necessarily a drawback, but something to think about it, and because you've got communal areas in that kind of arrangement, you do need to have those community rules, which are usually captured in something like a body corporate or a community land trust type arrangement. Setting these things up also costs money. All of it costs money. And I'm going to go through and show you a bit of an estimate that we put together based on one of his examples. Before I do that, Noosa Plan has some interesting definitions that have been introduced. So they do have that multiple housing definition, essentially, being able to use the use of premises for 2 or more dwellings. That makes sense. They've got 4 different types of multiple housing defined. Not too sure what type 1 is, but type 2 to 5. And type 4, the conventional one, has a really nice addition to it, where the use includes units, townhouses, flats, apartments, villas, and small dwelling units, which are defined as containing no more than 2 bedrooms, no study, no media room or other rooms capable of being used as a bedroom, has no more than 90 square metres of gross floor area. So this is targeting tiny houses, fixed tiny houses. And they do allow them in residential use zones. So and again, sorry, big disclaimer, I haven't had the chance to really go deep into the Noosa plan, but as far as I can understand, for example, you can buy a suburban block in a low density residential area and do that kind of development. In terms of a cost estimate that we've done, we used the example that we worked on as part of a design competition that we did nearly 2 years ago again, where the starting point was a 700 square metre block with an old Queenslander at the front. Competition was about how do we do density and diversity well, so how do we increase density and how can we replicate that across the neighbourhood. And the entry that we put in was essentially this. We kept the old house, we split it in two. The front half becomes the dwelling for the person who lived in that house, so downsizing. The back end becomes a communal area, so think, shared kitchen or a nice lounge room, with games or whatever. And we put 2 tiny houses in the backyard. Everybody has a bit of, a private courtyard, a private space, outdoor space, and then there's communal areas for, veggie patches, chicken coops, whatever. So, again, this is based on Brisbane City Council fees and charges. The cost prior to construction, I've included the purchase of land in this one, which obviously if you already own a block of land, then obviously you take that off, and it does represent the major proportion of the cost, but let's not forget that you need that land. Then to actually prepare a development application for the council, you will need architectural drawings and engineering reports being prepared, so that you need fees for those professionals. Then you need the actual development application being put together. So you'll need the services of a town planner, and then you'll need to pay the fee to council for lodging that development application. And I'm pretty sure in those fees I've allowed, I think, about $4,000 for the town planner, so the rest of that is council fees. Then you will need to lodge a building application to go with that. And I've allowed the building certifier fees, I think, of about $2,000. So the rest of that, again, is council fees. Very cheap to put in a plumbing and drainage application. You also need the services of a solicitor to put together the paperwork around the community title. And the final one, which is the biggie, are infrastructure charges. So those charges are put on by councils onto developers to fund the future upgrades of services such as your sewer, your water, electricity, garbage collection, etc. So the theory is that as you do development, you will generally increase the density of the population there, so you'll bring in more people. Those people will put on extra demand on those services. And so upfront, the council will try to get money from the developer to fund future upgrades. I certainly have a big problem with these kinds of dollars when we're talking about tiny house developments, because they're not really appropriate for the type of, impact that tiny house developments would have on the local area. And that's one of the areas that we would like to explore further, but haven't had time as yet. Then you need to obviously look at, doing the construction. So we've allowed some money to do those modifications to the existing dwelling. We've added the cost for a tiny house. Site preparation, if you need to do any kind of, levelling of the block to put on the tiny houses, etc. And the landscaping to kind of, make it look like the drawing that we had. Again, some pretty hefty fees for meter connections, and again, that's related to having a title. So if you're going to have each dwelling unit having its own title, then there's certain requirements around designs and reports that need to be prepared for electricity and water. and obviously the solicitors and surveyor fees to draw up the plans, the survey plans, and lodge the titles. We think, I know Sandy didn't seem particularly keen on it about the whole idea of owning the land, and but it's potentially an area where, you know, if you could have some of those costs adjusted down, then having your own bit of land and being able to transfer that ownership to other people, so sell on your tiny house afterwards, probably might help with, you know, people getting onto the ladder of, you know, being able to save up some money and get a loan for a slightly larger house afterwards. So those are pretty big numbers, and I guess this exercise was just to highlight the fact that, you know, even though some of these development types are legal and, you know, you can put in a development application, you really need a fair amount of money to be able to get them through. Which is why a lot of people try to go the route of movable dwellings, tiny houses on wheels, to try to get around all the planning and building regulations. But there are drawbacks with that model as well. So in our tiny house planning resource, we explored, I guess this is kind of like the movable dwelling version of a granny flat, where people, you know, you're looking for a bit of land to park your tiny house, and this is somebody's backyard. So you're leasing somebody's backyard to be able to do that. Strictly speaking, you could say it's legal, but only for a short term. And this is where those local laws around, you know, health and nuisance and things come into it, because lots of councils have rules about whether or not you can be camping or temporarily living in a caravan. Temporary living is allowed, for example, for a period of up to 6 months if you're going to be building a home on that land, but you need to have a building permit to demonstrate that that is the case. And those camping restrictions vary from council to council, anywhere from actually not being able to do it at all, for example, in the Gold Coast City Council area, to actually being allowed to do it in Brisbane City, supposedly, to other councils having, you know, 2-week restrictions or maybe 3 months being allowed to do that, which obviously is not, you know, for somebody who wants to live and be settled in one place for a long term, that's just not suitable. And we know that councils will try to find ways of other ways of making you move on by asking you for planning or building permits. So that was the case for Lara, where the Brisbane City Council said, looks like you're here permanently, you're going to need a building permit. We know of another couple who've been asked by the same council for a relocatable home park development application, even though there's only one of them in that person's backyard. Another option is what we've called a tiny house park. So think caravan park, but for longer term stays and specifically for tiny houses on wheels. So obviously, again, it's legal if you can find caravan parks where long-term residence is allowed, which they're getting fewer and fewer, or a relocatable home park. Relocatable home parks and caravan parks, so councils have restriction or regulate where you can do those kinds of things by identifying specific zones where you can do these, that particular use, but they tend to be situated, you know, on the outskirts of cities, you know, on the fringes of suburbs. So not ideal locations if you also, you know, need to commute into town. I was looking at the Brisbane City Council rules around that, and in fact in Brisbane City you cannot do a new relocatable home park development within the Brisbane City Council area. You can only take one that already exists and do something, you know, maybe redo it, revamp it, whatever, but you cannot make new ones within the Brisbane City Council. But in Noosa, going back to that multiple housing definition, they've identified a relocatable type, which is premises used for relocatable dwellings, whether permanently located or not, that provides for long-term residential accommodation. And they allow it in some of the residential zones. So again, very progressive approach, very interesting move, and certainly something to watch. Just the next step with that particular use in the plan, and this is where, again, the kind of reading you might need to do if you're thinking about doing something like this. This is the first or one of the criteria you would need to meet if you're wanting to do a relocatable home park under Noosa plan. So the left-hand side is about the kind of, you know, the outcomes that the council is after, the performance criteria, if you want. And on the right-hand side are kind of like specific solutions that if you can tick the box against each one of those, then you should be able to get your development application approved fairly easily. I'll just point out that the first solution there is a minimum site area of 2 hectares. So I don't know Noosa very well, Noosa Shire very well. I don't know how many blocks of land of 2 hectares are actually zoned low density residential, but that could possibly be a bit difficult. So what we're trying to do is come up with fit for purpose regulations. So how do we change, how do we tweak all those restrictions, constraints to allow tiny house developments? So on the planning regulation side of things, we think that having a tiny house definition is not necessarily crucial, but I think it would certainly allow the tiny houses to be clearly identified in planning policy as a legal type of housing, just like units, townhouses, apartments, etc. And having it at that state level means that it would then flow down to all councils eventually, which would then drive councils to be able to define specific codes for tiny house developments, which would then make it easier for us to create these sorts of developments. And the big one is about really looking at those infrastructure charges. Now, this is a space I'm not familiar with, but as far as I understand, some of it is actually, comes from the state, and some of it is council. So again, getting all these people in the room to really relook infrastructure charges is a challenge. On the building side of things, haven't really talked about building regulations that much. But we know obviously that fixed tiny houses by default have to comply with building regulations. We've looked, we've had a building certifier and commercial manufacturer of tiny houses, being Lara, and ourselves look at the building code to assess whether or not tiny houses on wheels or movable dwellings could actually meet those regulations, for example. And we know that from a construction perspective, as in, how do you build your walls and your roof and all that sort of stuff, there should be no issues. But the code really needs to make an allowance for small dwellings, and the fact that there's certain design features in those sorts of dwellings that at the moment contradict the code, but there should be a relaxation around those things. And they're mostly to do with the loft and the associated constraint of minimum ceiling heights and the stairs to get up to that loft. Now, we know that there's a precedent that's been set in the USA where they have been able to get a relaxation of those things through their building code. So I think it's the case of kind of, trying to get that through here as well. Around health and nuisance, those local laws that have, in some instances a complete ban on living in a caravan. I guess one thing we need to remember is that the reason those restrictions are in place is because in the past there have been some very poor outcomes of people living in caravans and creating, environments that were not healthy, that were not safe. And so what we're saying is, okay, let's go beyond this. We do not want these kinds of, slums, but that shouldn't mean there should be a complete ban. What we're thinking, and it's within the council's remit to be able to do this, is to create actually a local law that's specific to living in a tiny house. And again, having that definition may become important, where that local law would have specific provisions about how do you ensure health, safety, amenity, privacy, access for emergency vehicles, those sorts of things that we take for granted within, our normal sort of mainstream suburbia, but that's what the regulations actually provide, is for us to have those benefits. These things could be easily included in a very short code, and it could be regulated through a permit process to make sure that those things are being implemented, and it could be done very reasonably cheaply. A longer term resolution around this could be to actually have tiny houses on wheels identified within the planning framework as a special type of permanent structure, which means, yes, they would come under, all those regulations, but having those things under that kind of regulation also gives you the advantage of, getting finance for them, actually being able to get a loan to do things, getting insurance, because they will be recognised as, legal types of dwellings. How am I doing with time? Got plenty of time? So how would a tiny house on wheels get a building permit? Basically, if you can avoid currently, with the current building regulations we've got, you would need to keep the loft as a storage space. So it's about having lofts as a habitable room is the big issue. And there are also restrictions around the size of it. Having things like your electrical and your plumbing certified by a qualified tradesperson. One of the big ones that we've come across by talking to various councils is about actually securing down the tiny houses on wheels. A lot of councils, especially in rural areas actually, where people have put containers or caravans or whatever, is that there's been things in violent storms, and we do have violent storms here in Queensland, where these things have just been blown around, and tipped over. So, and it all goes back to, council's liability around, allowing people to do these things, is they want it secured down. And you can get, tie-down systems or various ways of securing your movable dwelling to the ground. But that is really a concern for councils. This would also allow you to get an owner-builder permit, just like I know people do to build their own houses, which means that you could possibly certify some aspects of your build. But obviously a movable dwelling, you need to think about the thing that it's being built on. So, your trailer also needs to meet certain requirements. How do you go about securely attaching your tiny house on that trailer? Those sorts of things are not covered by the building regulations. And being aware of actually where you're placing your movable dwelling. If you're not under planning regulations, which will make you look into these things like your flood zones or your bushfire zones, if you don't come under those planning regulations, then it's something that you need to become aware of and consider. Okay, I'll quickly go through this. Last year, Rikki and I had the opportunity to meet with some of the councils in southeast Queensland with the help of Q Shelter, who's a community housing member body. And this is just a quick summary of some of the things we found out. Obviously, all councils understand fixed tiny houses. Like I said, it's just a normal house, but in tiny. And most of them have occupancy restrictions. All councils were a little bit concerned about tiny movable dwellings for all the things that we've talked about already. As you would expect, maybe rural councils tend to be more conservative than urban councils. So, when you're talking innovative sort of solutions, they're kind of not quite there. Sandy mentioned the over 55 women's cohort, which is becoming the largest demographic group to become at risk of homelessness. The concept of a tiny village for that cohort is very well received by most councils. They would consider it. And a lot of the councils would be interested in seeing a demonstration project, but very few would like to be the first one to do it. Making money out of development is unfortunately a reality for councils. So they will always be looking for how to make money out of this sort of thing. So again, infrastructure charges is one of them, council rates is another. But again, this is about having a conversation with those councils to say what is appropriate for this type of housing. We've often talked to, when we've met with the councils, we've often talked with the actual officers, like the council employees who work within those planning departments, and they're quite open to the idea and would love to dig in deeper, but they cannot make the change to the planning schemes. It's the councillors, it's the political side of the councils who do that. And so that goes back to what Sandy was saying, where you need to talk, it's the community talking to their councillors to then influence the change. And yes, they're all interested in staying informed. So we've invited a lot of them to come today to this event. I don't know whether any of them are here, but... So just in closing, I was very encouraged by the things that I saw in the Noosa plan. There's some really interesting innovations in there, and it's going to be certainly something to watch, and it will be watched by those councils that are interested in tiny houses, because a lot of things that are done by one council, over time, seeing those developments take shape, seeing the outcomes, whether they were able to achieve the things they wanted to achieve with that. If it works, then other councils will more readily adopt similar sort of provisions. So definitely interesting. The media profile for tiny houses is still very high. I don't think it's going to go away because we still have affordability issues and still no solution. And obviously media profile means pressure on the politicians. So let's keep it up. And another aspect that I've seen lately, which is also very encouraging, is that a lot of the professions involved in town planning, architecture, urban design are really starting to look at small dwellings and tiny houses. And the Planning Institute of Australia, which is the professional body for town planners in Queensland or nationally, actually awarded us a commendation for work we did with a tiny house planning resource. So that's to show the level of how serious they're taking that work, and the fact that tiny houses is becoming a serious housing typology that they're looking at. And we also know that the Planning Institute publishes a journal called the Australian Planner. In June, I think it is, they're looking to publish a special edition which will be tiny house focused only. So they are taking it seriously. These are people who can help with a change and try to get tiny houses to be more mainstream. Thank you.